This happened 4 months after the birth of our beautiful baby girl. Our little girl was the sweetest, most gentle little newborn any new parent could have asked for. We named our little one after the month she was born in, May. May was born on a rainy night. I was the only one in labor on the entire floor that night. Like any new mother, I was exhausted after hours of labor. All I wanted to do was rest. My husband Matt looked after our little one while I rested a bit, but he eventually fell asleep too. I was laying in my bed watching my new family sleep peacefully when I felt a sudden urge to use the restroom. I called for my nurse, asking her to help me get up and walk over to the bathroom. After a few minutes, the nurse came in. I hushed her as she began speaking. I pointed to Matt, who was passed out on the sofa. The nurse and I quietly exited and began walking to the bathroom. As we were making our way back to my bed, another nurse came in carrying a small blanket. She walked in and began looking around. When my nurse asked her who she was looking for, her coworker looked confused. She began explaining to us as she was passing over to the nurse station. She walked past her room and saw a little girl with long black hair standing on her tiptoes, looking at her newborn baby girl. The nurse mentioned that the little girl was wearing a dress and assumed she might need a blanket since the room was chilly. I looked at my nurse confused and a little worried that someone else's kid could just walk into my room and look at my newborn without anybody but the nurse noticing. I quickly told her that May was my firstborn and that we weren't expecting any visitors. I asked if perhaps the little girl had gotten separated from her parents' room. However, my nurse was quick to mention that there were no other families at the moment with children on the floor. A few months after that, Matt and I moved into our new home. We were immediately welcomed by everyone, and we liked our new neighborhood. As we were unpacking and setting up May's room, I pulled out some baby monitors that we were planning on using now that May would be sleeping on her own. Matt and I were testing the baby monitors for a while. He was upstairs in May's room, and I was downstairs in the kitchen. After a few successful tries, I began making dinner, leaving my baby monitor on the counter. I was cutting vegetables when I began to hear static on the monitor. Thinking it was Matt probably messing with it upstairs, I ignored it and turned it off. I walked over to the fridge when I heard a very faint voice. I walked over to the counter and picked up the monitor, pressing firmly against my ear. A very faint but identifiable noise was coming from the static. I realized right away it sounded like a young child's laughing. I turned around looking at May. She lay quietly on her swing, sleeping soundly. I turned back to the monitor, trying to make out the noise again, when suddenly it stopped. The lights on the monitor went down and stayed off. Matt came in the moment through the back door, carrying some tools from the shed. I asked him if he had taken the baby monitor with him outside. He looked at me and laughed at my strange question. He replied back saying that he had left the baby monitor upstairs a while ago. I began telling him what I had just heard. He shrugged it off and explained that it was most likely interference from another family's monitor. A few days after that, I decided to take May to the park. We left home and began making our way down the street when my next door neighbor stopped us. My next door neighbor was a sweet old lady. She began talking to May and asked me how everything was going. She was very good around May, and she held her excitedly and began telling me how nice it was to have a baby in the neighborhood. I asked her if there were any other children in the neighborhood, to which she quickly replied, no. Oh sweetheart, there haven't been any children here in a long time, but it's sure nice to finally have one around. She continued playing with May. As I began remembering the baby monitor static, I assumed that the monitor probably didn't work anymore, and told myself to remember later to tell Matt that we needed a new one, when she began talking again. She mentioned that she was always willing to babysit, in case Matt and I ever needed it. I thanked her for her offer and began pushing May's stroller when she suddenly turned towards me and replied, "Of course, dear. I can understand if you need a break. This little one has a mouth, doesn't she? I heard her cries all last night. I couldn't help but to think, what strong lungs she has." I looked at her confused and began explaining that May always slept through the night and cried very little. May certainly didn't cry loud or long enough for someone next door to hear. She nodded, then winked at me. She most likely thought that I was attempting to hide my embarrassment at being unable to control my crying baby when she turned around and walked back to her house. That night, I told Matt what our neighbor had said. He laughed, saying exactly what I had earlier. May sleeps through the night. and hardly ever cries. That old lady is crazy, or probably missing her meds. I agreed and asked him to replace the baby monitors before changing the conversation. The next day, Matt installed the new baby monitors before he left to work. May and I stayed home for the rest of the day. We left one baby monitor in May's room, another one in the bedroom, and another one in the kitchen. I was upstairs cleaning our room, which was directly across the hall and 2 doors away from May's, when I began hearing the static again. I walked over to my nightstand and sat in my bed, attempting to make out the sound from the baby monitor. I didn't hear May crying, but instead I heard the same laughter I heard with the previous monitor. I walked over to May's room carrying the monitor. Once again, she was sound asleep. May's monitor wasn't even playing anything. It stood on the dresser, silent. The lights didn't even turn on as I heard the laughter through the monitor I was carrying. Thinking it was strange, but not yet giving it to any paranormal explanation, I began walking downstairs to the kitchen when the sound suddenly stopped. I tried to shrug it off and continued cleaning, figuring that perhaps the area we live in made it easier to pick up sounds at a further distance. That night for dinner, I didn't tell Matt about the noise incident earlier that day. Matt seemed tired from work, and I didn't want to worry him with something that seemed like nonsense. A few nights after that, Matt and I were sleeping when I suddenly awoke. I was drenched in sweat and couldn't fall back to sleep. I decided to get up and go check on May. As I walked across the hall towards her room, I heard the static noise coming from downstairs. I stopped and pushed May's door open to make sure she wasn't awake. But sure enough, she was asleep, as always. The static was coming from the kitchen. I knew it was coming from the monitor. Being sleepy and tired, I became annoyed and decided to go downstairs and shut it off. I entered the kitchen and turned the lights on, reaching for the monitor on the counter. I turned the monitor around, looking for a button to shut it off, when I realized it was already off. I stood there dumbfounded and placed it back on the counter, walking away thinking that perhaps I had imagined it when I heard the static again. I turned around immediately. The lights on the monitor were on. I walked over, getting ready to throw the monitor across the room, when the sound stopped again. There's a large trash bin next to the counter. It was one of those ones you would step on in order to flip up the lid. As I stood there, staring down at the monitor, I caught a glimpse of a reflection on the trash bin. For a few seconds I saw what looked like a small child. A little girl reflected on the trash bin and directly behind me. I turned around terrified, expecting to see her. However, no one stood behind me.